Yes, Steve is right. We had incredible progress up until 2009, but in the world after 2012, I think our institutions, the institutions of liberal democracy, are in such danger that it's quite possible that the future will not be like the past. I don't know what's going to happen, but I now see that as a possibility that I didn't see 5 years ago.
And what do you see as the danger at the moment?
So the danger, I think, is that a secular liberal democracy is a miraculous thing, but a fragile thing. And we briefly thought in the 1990s, with the fall of the Berlin Wall, that this was the end of history. Liberal democracy had won. Eventually, North Korea, Iran, well, everybody's going to be a liberal democracy. Once they get a little richer, they'll want that. But now it's clear that the founders were right that a diverse democracy, a democracy per se, is very difficult, very fragile, and as Madison said, as violent in their deaths as they are short-lived in their lives. And so the 20th century, we had all kinds of centripetal pressures, including especially World War II, binding us together. We had briefly a centripetal media system where we all got the same news. So we had the high point of professional journalism. It wasn't that way before the 1920s, and it isn't that way after 2012. So there was this period where the institutions that grounded us to truth, or rather gave us a process by which we could make progress towards truth and weed out terrible ideas, that, it turns out, was just a temporary thing. And I see it fading away. And this is, so Jonathan Rauch has a book coming out in a week or two called The Constitution of Knowledge. Steve is going to cover a lot of this in his book on rationality. So let me kick it over to Steve. Steve, what do you see? Do you see that things are changing in the last 10 years or so in ways that are a danger to a liberal democracy such as ours?
Some of them are, although in the last 10 years, globally, we've seen extreme poverty continue to decline. We've seen war decline after the blip from the Syrian civil war, which temporarily reversed the trend. We've seen movements like the legalization of gay marriage in the United States, the restrictions in the application of the death penalty. So there are a lot of these long-term movements that are continuing. And you also got to remember that in the 60s and 70s, for one thing, domestically, there were weekly bombings and riots with police shooting a dozen rioters a night. The Weathermen, the Black Liberation Armies, the Mayanese Liberation Army.
I'm getting all of that too. Oh yeah, things are materially things are continuing to get better. I give you all of that.
And if you listen back, I mean, I've been watching the Apple TV series 1971, the year that music changed everything.
Oh, cool.
Highly recommended.
Okay.
It's a reminder of a lot of the political inanity of our generation and our older brothers and sisters who were Maoists, who were Marxists, who were violent insurrectionists, and not just in rhetoric, but there really was a lot of violence. There were bombings, there were judges whose heads were blown off.
Oh my God.
It was a pretty ugly time. And even in terms of, it's certainly true that there is no overall progressive force toward liberal democracy, and there's absolutely been a recession in the last decade in countries like Hungary and Turkey and the United States and Russia. On the other hand, if you look at the graph of number of democracies scaled by how democratic, how autocratic they are, we've backslid maybe to 2010. We have to remember that in the 1970s, there were only 33 democracies on Earth. Half of Europe was behind the Iron Curtain. Spain and Portugal were literally fascist dictatorships. All of Latin America, juntas, banana republics, military governments. Taiwan was a military dictatorship. South Korea was a military dictatorship. There has been some backsliding, but not back to the 1970s. So it's sort of premature to abandon the liberal democratic ideal. I agree that there is some, it's not so fragile that we have gone all the way back to the 1970s. And there are some built-in advantages, like people want to live there. That's where people who vote with their feet end up. We know from, and John, I know you covered this in your book on happiness, but people in liberal democracies are happier. And together with material affluence, which of course liberal democracies are very good at delivering. The second, as I recall, contributor to happiness is a sense of freedom. So there is at least pushing in the direction of liberal democracy against, agreed, the tribalist and authoritarian and magical thinking. There is people's desire for prosperity and freedom, at least for themselves, and pushing back against the kind of the positive feedback loops, the vortexes of misinformation and fake news and so on. There is the fact that reality is that which doesn't go away when you stop believing in it. And Jonathan Rauch is clear in his book, which just recently came out, which I admire as much as you do, that there are because reality is still there. There's always a resource to that the constitution of knowledge, what he called liberal science, always has behind it, that in the end, you can't wish away reality for long.